So good morning, and I'd like to welcome you and say Happy New Year to you all. You've probably heard that a lot of times this week. And it's relevant because I'm going to put out a big number. In fact, not a big number, but an enormous number. This $500 billion, which probably sounds less relevant now as the campaigns are going on and they're throwing around trillion here, trillion there. This still represents an enormous number. And what this is, and Gil, I'm probably building on what you talked about this morning, is the direct and indirect costs of cardiovascular care in the U.S. in 2011. So this is unsustainable as a disease state. That translates to about $1.4 billion a day. So just to give it a little bit of meaning for us, this is a huge amount of money. We have $1,500, $1,600 per person per year here. So we have to do something about this disease that's really increasing in its prevalence and the cost and the unsustainability. For example, today in America, 37% of Americans have some form of cardiovascular disease. 37%. And that's increasing over time. It's the leading cause of death in America, and it's the leading cause of death around the world. Represents about 1/3 of the deaths worldwide. If you look at just the direct cost portion of heart disease is more than $250 billion. Huge amount of money. So in relative perspective, that's 17% of the healthcare budget. But the story doesn't end there. The forecast by the experts are that over the next decade, in fact, 2 decades, in fact, a little less now, 20 years from now, that's going to more than triple. And apples to apples would represent about half of the healthcare budget. This clearly is not sustainable. So in maybe a less glamorous animation than what you've presented before here, what I wanted to do is from 40,000 foot kind of capture the key elements of heart disease. And so there's lifestyle that potentially leads to patients having heart attacks. Heart attacks cause damage in the heart muscle that ultimately leads to progressive heart failure and death. And over time, governments, companies, and so forth have looked at trying to slow down these curves or change that fate of that disease, and with some success. For example, a few months ago, Secretary Sebelius, the head of the Health and Human Services, put $1 billion bounty on trying to affect lifestyle changes to lower the rate of heart disease. And predominantly that's around diet, exercise, smoking cessation, also being more, taking your drugs appropriately and so forth, if you have high blood pressure, aspirin, those kinds of things. And so that's one way to attack this, try to change behavior so that we can have healthier people, healthier lifestyles, so that we don't have heart disease. Device companies, drug companies, they've tried to change that curve, restoring blood flow, extending life, minimizing arrhythmias and other things. But those may change the slope of the disease, but they don't fundamentally change the disease. That's where we need a new paradigm. And that's where the promise of regenerative medicine comes in, because regenerative medicine is the first way that we have to really affect the heart muscle itself, its physiology. How can we change the damage that's done to that heart? How can we change its function over time and stop patients from progressing into heart failure? As you know, there's a lot of different approaches to cell therapy. This is a brand new field, new segment in medicine. Lots of ways people are looking at approaching this. From the Satori point of view, we have a very pragmatic and affordable approach where we take a patient's own tissue. We get it from their fat, so it's a mini liposuction. It can be done in the context of a patient that just had a major heart attack quite safely. It's about 100 cc, so half a can of Coke, takes 10-15 minutes to get, and they can do it in any room. They can do it in the cath lab, procedure room next door. It doesn't require an operating room. It doesn't require general anesthesia, so it's easy to get. They put it into our device, push a button, and about an hour later, they've got cells ready to infuse right back into that same patient. So they're getting their own cells that are unmanipulated, that are in the business of repairing tissue and minimizing tissue damage. That's what they're living in the body to do. So before I move on, I want to echo again what you've just heard in the last presentation, that the amount of damage to the heart is very predictive of the progressive disease. And there's a lot of papers in the literature that have studied this, and they suggest that if you have your left ventricle, which is kind of the main pumping chamber of the heart, if you have more than 18% of that damaged by the heart attack, then patients have a 50% chance to move into heart failure, or rate to move into heart failure within 2 years. And then more of the patients will go in over time. But by 2 years, half the patients with these large infarcts will be going into heart failure. But if you can minimize that damage, the rate drops 7-fold. So if you can get it under that 18% threshold, you have a much reduced population of patients going into heart failure. And heart failure is that's the part of the economic equation that's growing the most rapidly, 25% over year, and that's the biggest part of the overall budget for heart disease. So if we can address this at the time of the acute incident, reduce the damage, and prevent patients from going into heart failure, we can dramatically affect the economics as well as the life for these patients going forward. So we designed a European study using our cell source to treat acute heart attack patients that have large heart attacks. This was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, multi-center study. Turned out to be a small study, but with the primary endpoint looking at this most predictive measure of infarct size, so looking at the amount of damage to the left ventricle. So the patients receiving standard of care, and this again underscores the point earlier about the drugs and devices and all that stuff, that they don't really affect the damage. So in fact, the damage that was there at the time of the heart attack is there 6 months later, and you'll learn in a minute it's there 18 months later. And in these patients, the average was 25%, so a quarter of the left ventricle infarcted at the time of the infarct, and that was persistent over time. But the patients who had standard of care plus cell therapy was just randomized that way, a little larger heart attack, about a third of the left ventricle infarcted. But half of that damage was reduced over time by the cell therapy. So effectively erased half the damage of the heart attack. And what's most important is we're taking patients from this high-risk category to a low-risk category in terms of the progressive disease moving into heart failure. And this is important, and the question came up earlier. What happens over time? There's been a lot of studies that sort of have this early benefit, but it's a transient effect that falls off over time. In this study and in our subsequent studies, these are persistent effects over time. So the damage is erased at the early time point, and that's persistent as we go out over time. Now it's 18 months, which is a long-term follow-up. So it's predictive of going into heart failure, but what actually happened in these patients? So the patients receiving standard of care, we see over time at the 6-month time point, and now more dramatically at the 18-month time point, that these patients are moving into heart failure. So as was nicely described earlier, progressive disease, you've got your heart, left ventricle is damaged, it's weakened by that damage, so the heart, the blood in the ventricle is not getting pumped out to the body efficiently, so the heart begins to congest and get bigger. More blood volume into the heart, in theory, should allow for more blood volume going out to the body. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately, but the heart does congest as the reaction to this damaged tissue, and you can measure that by the volume of blood in these ventricles, either at rest or at full stroke. And so in systolic volumes, the measure of that ventricle, and you can see from this that these are clearly remodeling and dilating, which are putting these patients into heart failure. So what happens with the patients who receive cell therapy? They don't go into heart failure. So you see these remodel slightly, and then they stabilize over time. So these patients are not going into heart failure as predicted by the reduction in the damage of the muscle at the time of the infarct. So a little bit of discussion was about mechanism. Certainly there's a lot of different things at play here. Probably the most significant is about getting blood flow back into that heart muscle early. That's really the foundational issue with these heart attacks. The blood flow to the heart muscle itself is blocked off. So there's a lack of blood flow. There's also blood flow locally that's coming into that heart muscle that dies off as a result of the infarct. So going and putting a stent, restoring the plumbing, provides blood flow back, but downstream there's still local blood flow that's died off that doesn't come back. So when you put in our cell therapy population, we improved that, what they would call perfusion or blood flow through the heart muscle itself, well over 800% in that region that we targeted, so in the area of the infarct. And that, again, was persistent over time. So out at 18 months, we still had comparatively 800% better perfusion of that infarct zone over time. So you have better blood flow, less damage, leading to less decay into heart failure. And as a side note, we also noted that we saw both fewer patients having arrhythmias, and the patients who did have arrhythmias had dramatically fewer arrhythmias than the patients who received just standard of care. So you see highly statistically significant reduction in arrhythmia rates. And this is just another data point that suggests that these patients are better, the hearts are more stable, they're better, and they're functioning better over time. So this trial was important because not only safe from a workflow point of view, easy to take fat, process at the point of care, and within 24 hours of the heart attack, get this in there. We think time is muscle. We think getting in early is important. There's other mechanisms at work that I don't have time to describe, but that are relevant in minimizing that tissue damage, restoring the blood flow, minimizing the damage, preventing progressive disease, and making the heart better and more stable. And we think there's going to potentially be a very significant economic impact to that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So as I noted, this was a very small early safety feasibility trial. We've now taken that into a large pivotal trial, approval trial in Europe, and this is now enrolling patients, multi-center study. We're targeting up to 30, 35 centers across Europe. This will be a 360-ish patient trial, and about half the sites we're targeting in the G5. We have 60 sites identified who are interested in the trial. 23 of those are confirmed. It takes time to build the regulatory approvals because you have to go country by country. Even though it's EU, it sounds great, but the reality is every country has their own unique regulatory process, and that could take a few months to almost a year to get through countries like Germany or France or Italy. So it takes quite a long time to get these individual country approvals on the trials. We're well underway on that. And our goal is to have 30 of these centers up and running and enrolling by the end of the year. And if you're thinking, okay, what's the enrollment rates? Typical in these studies is about 1 patient per month per center. That's our target. It's a little bit above what our first trial was, but as a first-in-man, we ran that a little slower, so we think this is achievable. The overall timeline gets us to full enrollment and then data by kind of mid-2014 with an approval by early 2015 or late 2014. So fairly fast track to an approved acute trial, approved therapy in Europe. So the market this represents, if we just look at that large heart attack population of patients, at a $10,000 price point per therapy, it was mentioned that these are going to be expensive therapies. I think relatively this is fairly inexpensive. There's a lot of power in that pricing from our level in terms of what the cost of goods actually are as we make a tool and a consumable. So we have quite a bit of pricing leverage in that number. But I think it's a very affordable number, and that's relative to the cost of the care. So if we can do something disruptive that stops progressive disease, potentially, if you can just take that 50% of patients and prevent them from going into heart failure, in theory, and we have to prove this out in our future trials, but in theory, you could save in the first year over $50 billion. So in the U.S. political game where we're talking about how do we save $1 trillion, regenerative medicine might just be the answer in how we can cut healthcare costs. And this is just one good example of how regenerative medicine can be a whole paradigm shift and really change the way that healthcare is delivered and the cost of that care going forward. We've done another trial looking at the chronic patients. So for those patients that didn't get the benefit of this early on, they've now had the heart attack, they're in heart failure. There's a subset of these patients that are moving and progressing towards the bad end of heart failure, and they've already exhausted all their options from bypass and stenting and other revascularization procedures, probably maximal drug therapy. These patients are effectively on the track to die. Those are the patients we selected for this trial, and so-called no-option myocardial ischemia patients. We did a 27-patient, fully blinded, randomized, controlled, multi-center European trial. And the core thing we were looking at here, the primary endpoint, is around the function of the heart, measured by MVO2. And this is the most important predictor for key things in that patient's progression and fate. For example, when they're MVO2, it's a measure of the maximum capacity of the oxygen of the heart to produce work. It's a key functional measure. And when MVO2 hits 14, these patients buy a seat on the transplant list, and below that level, they've got a 50% mortality. In the range above that, it's probably 20% per year mortality rate. So these are very, very sick patients. And the patients who had standard of care in our trial followed the natural course of the disease. You see them getting sicker over time, losing function, really approaching that line of transplantation and declining function. The patients who received cell therapy, though, slightly improved, and then that improvement stayed stable over time, long time, out to 18 months. So this is highly statistically significant, and even though it was a very small study, key functional metric. And this was echoed by a number of other things we looked at in the trial. For example, the metabolic equivalent, statistically significant. We saw a reduction in the amount of damage to the heart as the heart's remodeling and improving its function. We saw better perfusion in the heart, again, as angiogenesis and creating blood flow as a core mechanism. We saw that effect here as well with better perfusion of the heart. And we also saw a trend in mortality. Again, as I mentioned, we'd expected 20% mortality, cardiac mortality in these patients going into the trial. In the cell-treated group, we had less than 5% today, which is almost 3 years now past treatment of these patients. So we should see somewhere in the 14, 15 patient range having died, we see 1. Whereas on the standard of care patients, at the 28 time point, we had 33% mortality. And again, very small numbers, so it's hard to really make any great statements about this. But it's trends, and it's important in looking at least in this early study, the potential benefit of using cell therapy in these patients. So what are we doing moving forward? We have two different programs. For the U.S., we're bringing that here in a phase 1/2 type trial. We're a device, so it's pilot pivotal, but it's the equivalent of a phase 1/2. That's now in front of FDA as an IDE, and we expect to have a few rounds of negotiation back and forth to really define out the protocols, but we anticipate starting that trial sometime in the summer or later this year, depending on the timing with FDA, and bringing that into the U.S. and then going to a pivotal after that and getting that to market. In Europe, though, there's an opportunity because we saw such dramatic data and statistically significant outcomes, and you've got a class of patients that have no therapeutic option that are effectively dying. We've gone to our regulatory groups there, the British Scientific Institute, and showed them the data. That the systems are already approved over there. All of our products are effectively approved in Europe. So we want to expand our label to include this particular class of patients based on the benefit we've seen in this trial and the very, very clear safety profile. So we're in front of the notified bodies currently, and we're anticipating an approval for chronic ischemia in Europe sometime in the next few months. So partly the ball's in their court, and we're pushing them hard. We don't control their timing, but we've already spent about a year getting through all of the review of the devices, the enzymes, the processes, and now they're really looking at the long-term data and in order to make the decision to win us an approval there in Europe. This represents a huge market. If we just focus on the 5 major markets in Europe, it's a $20 billion market, just this subset of the heart failure market. So, if you're talking about heart disease, it's multiples of this, but just this no-option chronic ischemia patient population represents a very, very significant market in Europe. Likewise, for our technology, which is different than the previous presenter, we've been working on this for about a decade. We've invested something north of $300 million developing the technology, understanding the science behind it, understanding how it works, how to make it safe, running out the trials. So we've been at this for quite a while, invested a significant amount of money, and we've protected it as you'd expect we have. So we just, in the past few weeks, had a cardiovascular patent that's very broad in Europe issue. There was one opposition that we think we'll be able to work through, but that patent's now issued and enforceable, as well as in other places around the world and in other indications across the spectrum, as this really is true platform technology. So last slide, I just want to summarize, and probably echoing again, Gil, what you talked about this morning, that cardiovascular disease is really a very, very significant problem and represents an enormous opportunity. We think in our condition that cell therapy using a solution system will both be safe and effective in treating both acute and chronic conditions. We've shown that early in our first trials. We're now proving that out in larger trials. But the takeaway for the room and for the group is that regenerative medicine is really the next paradigm that we're going to see, and we need to see a shift in healthcare that really gets to the regenerative part of care, that reverses this damage and prevents ongoing and future progressive disease that will not only save money, but it'll save lives and it'll improve lives overall. Thank you very much.